Hello, everyone. It's Larry Kotlikoff. I'm delighted, really thrilled to be talking to my great buddy, Glenn Lowry, about his new autobiography called Late Admissions, Confessions of a Black Conservative. This is the book. Everybody should buy it because it's a fantastic book. Let me just kind of read the very first page as a way of introducing the book and also Glenn. It's a shockingly frank memoir from a prize-winning economist reflecting on his personal odyssey, his remarkable personal odyssey, and his changing positions on. Glenn, I think you have some noise in the background.
Yeah, let me close the door.
Yeah.
Hey, baby, I'm going to be talking to Larry for his podcast for the next 45 minutes or so.
So I will just start over, okay?
Yeah, we're good.
We'll just start over, okay? Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Economics Matters, the podcast. I'm delighted to have my very longtime friend and very good friend, Glenn Lowry, to speak to us today about a very important book called Late Admissions. This is Glenn's autobiography. It just came out, and it's a marvelous book. It's called Late Admissions, Confessions of a Black Conservative, Glenn C. Lowry. And let me just read from the first page of the description of the book, and it also describes Glenn, a shockingly frank memoir from a prize-winning economist, reflecting on his remarkable personal odyssey and his changing positions on identity, race, and belief. Economist Glenn Lowry is one of the most prominent public intellectuals of our time. He's often radically opposed to the political mainstream and delights in upending what's expected of a Black public figure, but more so than the arguments themselves on affirmative action, institutional racism, Trumpism. His public life has been characterized by fearlessness and a willingness to recalibrate strongly held and forcefully argued beliefs. In other words, Glenn changes his mind, and that's really the hallmark of an intellectual. If you're not, and a scholar, if you're not willing to change your mind, what game are you in? If you're an academic, if you know everything to begin with, why get into the discussion? Just tell everybody the truth. Anyway, Glenn has been a seeker of the truth, and he changes his mind when he finds that he changes his mind. But this is my paraphrasing. I'm getting in the middle of the first page here. Lowry grew up on the south side of Chicago, earned a PhD in MIT's economics program, and became the first Black tenured professor of economics at Harvard at the age of 33. He has been at turns a young father, a drug addict, an adulterer, a psychiatric patient, a born-again Christian, a lapsed born-again Christian, a Black Reaganite who has swung from the right to the left and back again, not black again, back again. In Late Admissions, Glenn examines what it means to chart a sense of self over the course of a tempestuous but well-considered life. Glenn is the Merton P. Stoltz Professor of the Social Sciences and Professor of Economics at Brown University. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He lives pretty close to me in Providence. I'm still working up at Boston University, but I came down to, my wife and I came down to hang out with Glenn and his lovely wife, Luan. Glenn, this is a tremendous book. First of all, hello. Thanks for coming on to talk about it. And congratulations. It's not just, grabbing one's throat from what actually is being described, but the way it's written is exceptional. Every paragraph is, every sentence is essentially perfect from what I can tell. And I've been reading it off and on since you gave me a copy of an early copy. And, it's just gripping. Tell us why you wrote the book. Give us a little on into this.
Well, Larry, first of all, let me thank you for that lavish and extended praising introduction. I appreciate it. I really do. And I value our friendship. And I've been asked this question actually at my podcast. My conversation partner, John McWhorter, that was the first thing he said to me when we discussed this book. Why did you write? He says, I can't imagine doing something like that myself, your life story. And I did feel compelled to do it. And I've been talking about doing it for a long time. So the idea has been percolating in my mind for many years. I took a sabbatical leave here at Brown in 2015-16, the academic year. That was 8 years ago. And went out to the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. You're supposed to sit in your room and you're supposed to write your book or your paper or whatever. And I had as my project a book that I was calling The Enemy Within. And it was going to talk about my struggles and my challenges and, various travails and adventures and failures and disappointments and so on. And the struggle for self-command, the struggle for living in good faith, for living honestly, fully, this kind of thing. I had some kind of idea, but it never got written. I had a wonderful year. I got some notes. I didn't really get a chapter. I did get an outline and a framework, and I did some extended excursions on one or another theme, but I never got a manuscript. And that was 2016 when Lawan and I, my lovely wife, whom you mentioned, thank you, and I met. That was almost 8 years ago. But the idea has been there, and I had the good fortune of having an enterprising agent reach out to me and say, where's the book? Where's this book? This book has to come into existence. I've been hearing you talk about it because I would talk about it at the podcast. I would say, I'm writing it, And he cajoled, he hounded, he even went so far as to sketch a proposal based on some stuff that I had shown him. And Don Fair of the Trident Media Group in New York City is the guy. And Don, who has represented, Michael Spence. You remember Michael Spence?
Sure.
Former dean of the Graduate School of Business at Stanford, and Nobel honoree, and famous economists. Don has represented some really good people. So I signed on with him. We got the proposal in front of Norton, and we got a timetable and time and a framework, and I got to work. So
it's a big book. I mean, it's thick. How many pages we got here? We got over 400, 420 or so pages. You start out the book talking about in the preface that you're going to tell about your life, but you're going to, in an autobiography, people would, naturally want to put out the good side of their story. They'd want to embellish. But what you're saying in the book is a bit of from game theory is that you need to signal that you're actually telling the truth. And you're going to do that by giving the full truth, which is not all that pretty in many cases. You know, you went through, you know, as you say right here on the first page, you're a young father. You then, I guess, separated from your first wife, or got divorced. You became a drug addict after you had a lot of success in the economics profession. You got hooked on cocaine. You were an adulterer. All these things you're saying out front in this book. Psychiatric patient. You were so hooked that you had to go into McLean's hospital at Harvard. A born-again Christian as part of the way of coming out of this this trap that you were in. Then you decided, you know, at some point that Christianity was not where you really were any longer. Became a lapse, and a black Reaganite who then swings to the left and then swings back to the right. So there's lots of different, you know, it's a story that kind of has to be told because it's a pretty crazy story, right? And in some ways it's crazy, but it's, you know, let me ask you this question. Is this a story about everybody, or is this a story about, I mean, obviously everybody can resonate with almost everything in the book, but is this kind of a passage through life that we're all experiencing, but perhaps in less dramatic ways than you?
Okay. Before I address that question, let me respond to the mention that you made of how I start with the preface of the book. In conversation with the reader, author and reader talking, of course, I'm the one doing the talking, about what we're about to do. And what we're about to do is read this book about my life that I have written. Now, you being the reader know that my interests are to make myself look good, to get you to be a sympathetic reader, to like me. So you will, if you're smart as a reader, you're going to want to be wary. You know, you'll want to be on guard. You don't want to be gullible. You know, you don't want to be just take everything at face value. You want to look beneath the surface, read between the lines, as I put it. So since I know that, I've got a problem as a writer of, you know, self-presentation. How do I provide you a narrative that will serve my ends? And I recognize that a straightforward approach is bound not to work. I mean, if I just say I'm great, I am great, I am great, you're going to roll your eyes. That paradoxically, self-discrediting disclosure actually makes me a more credible narrator. I'm willing to tell you that about myself, you know. But it's not just a game of manipulation in which I'm trying to make a reader sympathetic and receptive to my deeper message. It's also a game with myself, because the construction of an account of one's life invites one into all kinds of traps of self-delusion and self-aggrandizement and, you know, looking in retrospect at what actually happened, honestly, is a real challenge. So I'm trying to kind of do both of those things. I'm trying to persuade a reader that I should be taken seriously, that despite the foibles, you know, the warts and all, there's a humanity, a decency, a seriousness of mind, a someone who's spiritually grounded and attuned, someone who's trying to be honest, something like that. There's a question of character. And so the paradox is that by the artful disclosure of self-discrediting information, I make myself a more credible narrator, and I earn a kind of uh, credibility that I can then expend when it really counts, when I really need you, the reader, to be with me.
Okay, and the journey with you is taking us from a pretty both good and horrible childhood. I don't want to give away too much of the book, so that's not my purpose here, but then you find your way to Northwestern, study math. I mean, then you get into MIT, you're holding your own with some of the best people who have ever gone into economics.
Can I interrupt, Larry? I know it's your show, but what I wanted to say was that yes, I talk about those. So you say a rough beginning. Yeah, I came up in a working class family on the south side of Chicago, Black. There were a few professionals here and there, school teacher, lawyer, but most people were, sort of middle class, some lower middle class. And my mother and father split up when I was young, and I was subject to all kinds of influences. I mean, I knew people who were gangsters. I knew people got shot dead. Good buddies I used to play stickball with in the alley. Kid bled out on his mother's basement floor. And many other anecdotes that I could convey, but it wasn't. It was complicated. There were a lot of positive influences, a lot of strong and admirable people, a lot of resources. I was not poor. My mother was a single mom. My dad struggled early in his career, although he's dead now, but he retired as a high-level manager in the Internal Revenue Service, directing a big income tax processing center in Kansas City. But there were drug addicts, and there were ex-cons, and there was just a lot of different stuff that was a part of the world that I lived in. But I got discovered. At a community college by a teacher who saw I was pretty good at doing the calculus problems. And then I got to Northwestern and just kind of, blossomed, was taking graduate courses in math and in economics when I was in my senior year at Northwestern. Had a stellar career, almost all A's. I took like 36 courses, and I got very good grades, and was a star, and discovered. I discovered books, I discovered philosophy, I discovered literature, I discovered the German language, I discovered real mathematics, not just puzzle solving these algebra things, but really proving theorems, what mathematical logic was, and the deep ideas in philosophy, political theory, and in economics. And I had some terrific teachers. So when I got to MIT, it just kind of completed this process of development. I mean, MIT was arguably the best department in the world at that time. It was certainly one of the best, one of the top 5 departments in the world. And it was highly competitive, and I did well. I did very well. Had great people. Bob Solo, the late Bob Solo, was my dissertation advisor. Peter Diamond was my second reader. I'm still in touch with Peter. These guys, are Nobel Prize winning economists. And I was right there holding my own. So thanks for letting me toot my own horn there a little bit. But what I'm saying is the education of Glenn Lowry how I became an intellectual. What were the founding influences? What were the books I read? I talk about books. I talk about ideas. I talk about teachers who inspired me. Um, One of them was an economic historian named Jonathan Hughes, who had been a student of Sir John Hicks at Oxford, and was a mentor of Joel Mokyr. You know Joel Mokyr, the great economic historian. Well, John Hughes was a kind of senior figure on Joel early in Joel's career. Anyway, John's a terrific guy. Played the saxophone. Loved a good glass of Scotch whiskey, and insisted when I first came back to Northwestern as an assistant professor that I not eat lunch in the faculty club at the Economist table. That was his one word of advice to me: don't eat with the economists. Go and sit at the general open table, and there'll be a physicist next to you, or there'll be a German literary scholar, or there'll be a number theorist, or this is a university. This place is a big, wide open smorgasbord of wonderful ideas, and you should not just sit with the economists. And I have been following that advice ever since. I'm an economist, but I don't eat lunch with the economists.
Yeah, no, I've noticed that over the years. You're definitely a Renaissance scholar, Renaissance man, in terms of your interests and depth of knowledge in all kinds of areas. But okay, so you go to Northwestern, you do really, really well. You go to MIT, you do really, really well. You get hired by Northwestern back as an assistant professor. That's
right.
Northwestern's probably ranked 7th best department in the world, or country at least at that point. And then you get hired by Harvard as a young tenured professor, right?
Yeah, I was hired in 1982, 6 years after my PhD, as a full professor of economics and of Afro-American studies at Harvard.
But now the question is this a blessing or a curse? Because what happens is you arrive at Harvard and you become very self-conscious of the fact that maybe they hired you because you're Black, as opposed to based on your work, your accomplishments. And
well, let me put it this way, Larry. Yeah, that's correct. That's not inaccurate, what you just said. I did worry about that. I thought I had to be great. I thought the company I was keeping at Northwestern when I was the assistant professor there, other people who were junior faculty included Roger Meyerson, Bengt Holmstrom, Paul Milgram. Again, all these people have ultimately been honored with Nobel Prizes of their own. They were doing the early days, economists will relate to this, of mechanism design, of incentive compatibility, of information economics, of contract theory. And it was heady days, man. They were writing these papers about bargaining, these beautiful theoretical papers about bargaining, about bilateral bargaining, about auctions, about the design of selling mechanisms that were the most efficient given the informational constraints. They had discovered ways of explicitly representing these ideas that had been percolating around, for a half century, but that had not found a kind of formalization. And they were working out. Leo Hurwitz, Stanley Ryder, these people, and they had connections with other people, with people at Carnegie Mellon who were doing similar kinds of stuff, people at Minnesota. Anyway, I was right at the center of it.
But you're also somewhat intimidated by it. You must have been somewhat intimidated because you go to Harvard and you think, why me? Why not these other guys come into?
I was going to get to that. Yeah, exactly. Am I good enough? Did I deserve it, so to speak? And yeah, the affirmative action thing, of course. I was hired as professor of economics and of Afro-American studies. Of course, it had something to do with me being Black and with my interest in race inequality issues. I was writing about those issues. My dissertation had partly dealt with those issues. So if I had been white and my dissertation dealt with those issues, I'm sure I would have come to their attention. Although, for that job, I think being a Black guy really helped a lot. Um, but it was, I didn't know if I was good enough to really cut it at that level, and I hadn't yet fully gotten my grounding as a scholar. I had some papers, I had a half dozen decent papers. I had an econometrica. I had a journal of political economy. I had a quarterly journal of economics. I had a review of economic studies. I had some papers.
But they weren't just, let me just say, they weren't just papers. These were, you may not have appreciated them in terms of the quality, and maybe they weren't as mathematical as the bargaining guys or the game theorists over at Northwestern that you left, but they were and are extraordinary papers.
Well, thanks for that. I mean, I had some decent papers, but what was next, and what was my program of research, and what was I about? The way I put it in the book is that I choked. It's like I worry about Jason Tatum. I know you follow the Celtics.
Right.
In the big games, in the playoffs. I mean, Jason Tatum is one of the best players out there. I hate to be heard on camera saying that I think Jason Tatum chokes. I don't want to really be heard saying that, but I gotta cheat. I just sometimes when the big game comes, he just doesn't quite come through for me.
Well, he's 25, right?
Yeah.
You were, how old were you? You were in your early 30s, probably, right?
Yeah, I was 32, 33.
I think, and one of the things you talk about in the book is that you meet Tom Schelling, who did end up getting the Nobel Prize for work
Another one.
Strategy, very famous economist,
yeah,
political scientist at Harvard, at the Kennedy School, and at some point you talked to him, and he said he kind of starts to laugh, right, and smile and say,
I have this heart-to-heart talk with him where I'm confessing that I'm afraid I'm not good enough. I don't know what my next paper is going to be. Am I going to survive? And woe is me. I'm in a crisis. And yeah, he started laughing in the middle of my confession, and I was just annoyed and befuddled by that. And he was laughing because he said, "You think you're the only one? You think you're the only one around here who's afraid somebody's gonna come up to him and ask them, what have you done for me lately? What are you working on now? And you don't have a good answer to that question?" He said, "Just relax and do your work. You'll be fine. This place is full of neurotics."
I think that's important. When I asked you why you wrote the book, you may not even know why you wrote the book, but I have a feeling that one of the things you're trying to do here in the book is get across the message that we all go through these crises of self-doubt, and especially if we're academics. I mean, I think almost every academic must have periods of anxiety, hyper-anxiety, and then that can lead to other issues. But I just recall walking across the street with Sherwin Rosen, who is the top labor economist probably in the world at the time. He's about 65. We're at the American Economic Association convention in Chicago. I say, "Hey, Sherwin, how you doing? We just bumped into each other walking across the street together." He said, "Terrible." I said, "How come?" He said, "I don't have a paper." I said, "Sure, what do you mean you don't have a paper? You're the top economist. You just did this fantastic paper on economics of superstars.
Yeah.
What do you mean?" He said, "You don't understand. At Chicago, it's not what you worked on yesterday. It's what you're working on today. Nothing you did in the past matters at all." And he was really depressed, and he was seriously unhappy. So this is kind of an issue, and I think it's cuts across fields. It's not just among academics. It's probably just a human, there's some people that are sure that they're the God's gift, and they can screw up because they're actually not God's gift and never really quite recognize it and get stuck in that mode and get angry because they weren't recognized. And then there are other people who are sure they're not God's gift, and that is very tough. But that's also a great incentivizer, right? To prove that you actually, it really, is like a kick in the butt to show to others and even to yourself that you can actually hack it. So you went through this period at Harvard, and then out of the blue, this period at Harvard where you got hooked onto cocaine, you were in the press, it was very embarrassing for you. You were involved, lots of things, right?
You don't know how deeply to go into the details. I was a prominent conservative critic in the late 1980s, and I was up for a job in the Reagan administration as deputy secretary of the Department of Education, where William Bennett was the secretary. This was in the second Reagan administration, and I was having an affair, extramarital affair with a young woman, which ended very publicly and in an ugly fashion. She accused me of assaulting her. I didn't assault her, and she subsequently withdrew the accusation. But the effect of that fiasco of public scandal, I withdrew from the political appointment, and I was in disgrace and in despair. This is the year 1987.
Front page of the Boston Globe, Harvard professor, right?
Yeah,
Arrested,
accused
right?
of assault. In the Boston Herald, they had a photo of the young woman who had appeared in court in a neck brace, alleging that I had injured her. I hadn't. We'd argued. It was an ugly scene. I was certainly responsible for the fiasco that befell me in terms of how I was conducting myself, even if I didn't actually do what I was accused of having done. Charges were subsequently dropped, but the damage to my reputation was done. And I had to kind of go through some stuff, and it was a dark period in my life, and I ended up chasing after cocaine highs in the streets of inner city Boston, harrowing adventures that I described to some degree in the book, robbed twice at gunpoint, you know, crack houses and housing projects and shady characters and things of this kind in which I was enmeshed. So yeah, all that is described in the book.
Yeah. So, but meanwhile, we should let everyone know that you had this fantastic, wife to support you, Linda Lowry, who was a professor of economics at MIT. No, sorry, at Tufts. You had met at MIT. She was a grad student there, and I, of course, and then I think that was, you had something concrete at home to keep.
Yeah, folks, she stuck it out. She stuck it out.
She stuck it out with you.
Unbelievably, this woman, she passed away in 2011, succumbed to metastatic breast cancer at the age of 59, mother of two, my sons, Glenn the second and Nehemiah, who are in their 30s now and are doing well. Nehemiah's out in California. Glenn lives in Brockton, Massachusetts, but they're both doing well. But in any case, she stuck it out, and I eventually came out of it, fitfully. I had drug treatment. I had relapse. I had to go into the McLean Psychiatric Hospital as an inpatient. I was in there for 2 months. it was quite an ordeal. Lived in a halfway house in South Boston, which I describe in the book, for 5 months after getting out of the hospital, just before our older son, Glenn the second, was born. And Linda was right there, and our marriage recovered.
Yeah. Uh, Linda was just amazing person. And uh, yeah, but part of this book is also about your family. I mean, you had two daughters and a son before you went even to MIT, right? For grad
Yeah,
school. And
that that's
so
true.
you have this kind of broken family, and then you've got this relationship that there's a discussion, which also makes this book universal about how you're going to interact with these prior children and how they're going to react to your new family and how you can reconnect with them. And this has been a lifetime challenge, but I think as an outside observer, it seems like things are not, never can be fully repaired from people's feelings of hurt, but you have a cohesive extended family that actually gets together in a way that, because you made that happen, you worked on that. And
That's true, Larry.
I give you great credit for that, because a lot of people would say this is just too difficult. We can't get people together. This was, and families do just have lifetime enemy, anger,
Enmity.
enmity. Yeah, that's the word, enmity. But then out of the blue, something happens, which is you come to Boston University. I was the chair at the time. No, I wasn't the chair. I was just an economist, but I had read one of these papers that you thought was so-so. That was the one that came out of the Econometrica, which you're kind of suggesting was so-so. I thought it was one of the best things I'd ever read by anybody, better than Meyerson or these other people that you're talking about. I don't know. I hadn't really read their stuff, so I couldn't say for sure. I can't say today for sure, but I was just so taken by it. And then I seen, we had never met. And basically out of the blue, I just picked up the telephone, if I recall correctly, and said, can we get you to come to BU? And thanks to John Silber, who was the president at Boston University at the time, we were able to hire you. And you arrived at BU, and this was, intellectually, I think, a fresh start. And I think you have the track record for more top 5 journal articles in economics within the shortest period of time, like 2 years. You have like 4 or 5 top 5 journal articles. This, for people that are kind of not familiar with top 5 journals in economics, you can think about Science and Nature in the sciences. So publishing in the journals that Glenn published in during that period and before and after, that's like publishing in Science or Nature, and if you're a scientist. And this is an amazing period of productivity, which might lead to a Nobel Prize for you, because it's all about the economics of racial discrimination, and also about affirmative action. But the roots of it's really about the economics of racism that you really wrote the foundational together with your co-author Coates from
Stephen Coate of Cornell
Stephen
University.
Coate at Cornell. He was at, I guess, LSE at the time, right? So anyway, so you get back into economics, and you also start saying that Glenn Lowry, the intellectual, and the public intellectual, is much more than just an economist, and you start kind of thinking and speaking publicly. Is this so throughout, I guess, the period in Harvard, and then obviously there's a lapse, but then you come to BU, and then continue into the present. You have this major podcast that you're, quite famous for, I think, to many people listen to you. So, and you've spoken, pretty clearly in ways that actually go against some of the stuff you wrote in this period of time when you were at BU about affirmative action, about whether or not we need it or not need it. And your view today is that you think the economy has kind of outgrown it, or our country has outgrown the need for affirmative action, might be doing more damage than good at this point.
Yeah, you're covering a lot of ground, Larry.
Yeah.
It started with my 1981 econometric paper, Intergenerational Transfers and the Distribution of Earnings.
Which is about the perpetuation of inequality across generations, why people are getting locked, why we see certain groups, Blacks in particular,
it uses
generation.
It uses the apparatus of state-of-the-art apparatus at that time, 1981, of growth theory, of optimal growth theory, stochastic optimal growth theory. There's a representative consumer who is making a trade-off of consumption now or later under uncertainty about returns. And there's a neoclassical production sector where the technology of translating investment and labor into output is specified, and this is a setup that is familiar to economists of that era. It's kind of gone out of fashion now, this kind of theorizing about economic dynamics, although you might still be practicing it, Larry. I don't know.
I still practice it,
but I just want to say, the innovation was adapting it to the study of inequality by postulating that the uncertainty represented differences in the luck or the innate endowments that a person had no control over that were specified by nature. And those differences then got filtered through the resource allocation mechanism centered around the family. Parents making investment decisions. They can consume or they can invest. They invest in the kid. The return on the investment is uncertain because the ability of the kid is uncertain. But the inequality in society is determined by a million cases of these kind of decisions being made by these representative individuals. And you can create the dynamics of inequality in this way in a natural mathematical representation, a stochastic process. And so you can study how the system behaves and, the asymptotic properties of the system and all this. And I know this is not a technical seminar. I just want people to get some flavor of what the research actually was.
Okay, but if I recall now, it's been a long time since I looked at the paper, but there's a perpetuation of inequality among different groups through time, if I recall correctly.
Different paper.
That's a different
The
paper.
econometric paper is not groups, it's society. And there's a representative individual, and then there's a stochastic evolution. So people are in different positions in the distribution. And you look at how the distribution behaves. But the other chapter in my dissertation, which was never published in a referee journal, it was published in a conference volume, and it has gotten thousands of citations. It has not been overlooked, but it was not in one of the top 5 journals, was about racial inequality and was making the point that the group disparities might persist even if you got rid of discrimination because of the intergenerational overhang. Because of the
persist forever or just temporarily?
Might persist forever. That you could get. So here was my argument. My argument was we've got the family, and that's one source of intergenerational influence. But we also have the community. So I imagine that there are externalities between families. So if I'm in the network web close to some other family that's doing well, that helps me. So this clustering is how I wanted to represent groups. The idea that social interactions would not be random in the society, but they'd be more likely to occur between people who belong to the same group. So if a group falls behind and these social interactions are endogenous, they are within group, you're more likely to be connected to somebody within your own group than someone else, then that can be a drag on the individuals within that group that can be self-reinforcing. And I worked out the mathematics of that, sufficient conditions for it not to happen, this kind of thing.
So this is kind of early with network theory, but also connecting sociology and economics in a very interesting way. And then when your work at BU with Coate with Steve is talking about another channel where if there's a perception out there that let's say blacks are less capable than whites, then the blacks, and if that affects decisions later on the labor market, then blacks may make decisions not to invest as much in these particular professions, and that can then be self-perpetuating. You want to talk about that for a bit?
Well, yeah, this was about affirmative action and negative stereotypes. We gave it the title, Will Affirmative Action Policies Eliminate Negative Stereotypes? Glenn Lowry and Stephen Coate, 1993, American Economic Review. And yeah, the two ideas there. One had to do with affirmative action. The other had to do with stereotypes. Now, stereotypes were self-confirming negative beliefs. So I think the group's not going to do well, and hence I'm not as inclined to give them the benefit of the doubt, since I don't want to invest in a loser. I'm the employer. The group workers know that if they belong to the discriminated group, they may not get the benefit of the doubt. And so they don't invest themselves to the same extent in performing at the firm, since they anticipate it's not worth their while, since they may not get the benefit of the doubt. The net result of those two things, the employer thinking they're not going to be quite as up to snuff and therefore withholding the benefit of the doubt, and the worker anticipating I won't get the benefit of the doubt, and therefore it's not worth my while to really buckle down, is an equilibrium where if you have a population that's divided into groups that can be easily distinguished at a glance from one another, there could be multiple equilibrium. You could be pessimistic about one group and optimistic about the other group, and that would be inequality. That was the baseline situation from which we theorized how affirmative action policies might affect that outcome. The question was, would it always go in the direction of equality? And what we were able to show was it need not, because if employers are aiming under affirmative action to get equal representation, but if they begin with beliefs that one group is lagging behind in terms of their basic preparation, they will be inclined to set a less exacting standard for hiring workers from the group that they're trying to ensure is equally represented, since they anticipate the need to be less exacting because they believe that on average, the group is performing less well. But the idea of being less exacting in the judgment about who to hire or not need not, could undercut incentives. It need not help. It need not give the right signal to the worker about whether or not to invest. I mean, put simply, if I think I'm going to get the job, whether I'm qualified or not, there's no point in me becoming qualified. Now, that's an extreme, exaggerated representation of an effect that is very real, even if not as extreme. Lowering standard, undercutting incentives, undercut incentives leads to lower performance. Lower performance leads to the belief that I have to lower standards in order to meet the affirmative action mandate. That's what we call a patronizing equilibrium.
You think, and you felt that Harvard was patronizing you when they hired you, and that it undercut your incentive to work harder. Is that part of what?
Well, no, I wouldn't necessarily apply it directly to my case, which is, you know, sui generis. It's one of a kind, my case. I mean, it wasn't just effort. It wasn't just effort. It was also confidence. It was also choking. can be distinguished from laggardliness. Choking is when you lose your nerve. You go when you blink. It's when you don't your hand trembles. You don't have the confidence in your capacities to be able to stay focused and apply yourself so as to perform up to you worry. You spend all your time with anxiety. You know about anxiety, and you can't produce when you're anxious to that extent. So I don't think my model with Stephen Coate necessarily gives an account of my own experience or of all the things that could go wrong with affirmative action. So I think a lot
Okay,
of
we're going
things
to talk
can go
about
wrong.
that in a, yeah. So let's talk about that. I mean, so, whether or not these papers that I think will ultimately lead to a Nobel Prize in economics, because it's, and, they do and they don't necessarily suggest the need for affirmative action. But they certainly lay out a framework for thinking about affirmative action systematically. So over time, you've been very influential, but you've been a conservative black conservative, and then a more liberal. You rejected the black conservative in you, and then you became, again, a little bit more conservative. Tell us about this transformation that you go through in the book. And well, I have to say that when you're reading the book, people through Glenn, the readers are going to meet all kinds of interesting folks. They're going to meet other intellectuals, they're going to meet politicians, they're going to meet, because Glenn has had so many experiences in his life that that's why the book is so, in many ways, so fascinating. Just the encounters you're having with all kinds of people, okay, that people just generally don't have. And you've met these people firsthand, and some of them, like Jesse Jackson, there's a discussion of your interaction with him and how he treated you, and it was better than you thought you worried about. But tell us about, your metamorphosis from black conservative to black liberal to black conservative again. And
I don't know if I was ever really liberal, but I was more liberal than at some point than and others, and less conservative and so on. I don't know if I can boil it down to just a sentence or two. I started out, I was trained at MIT in the 70s. It was social democrats. I mean, people who believed in the welfare state and whatnot. They were not Chicago. They were not free market ideologues and zealots. They did do price theory. I mean, as you know, and talked about incentives and efficiency and, all of that. But the idea that you would have taxation, that you needed regulation, that you needed a Keynesian management of aggregate demand and whatnot to fend off the problems of unemployment and all of that was very well accepted. So it was not a conservative ideological graduate education in economics.
It was quite the opposite at MIT, yes.
But it was not the New School for Social Research or something like that. It was not, there was a Marxist, maybe Lance Taylor or somebody on the faculty, but they were the odd person out. The sensibility of the place was not radical. It was not a critical theory kind of approach to economics. Although there were some people like the labor economist Michael Piori, for example, I remember him, who were, very, very friendly to some of the more sociological and sort of socialist approaches. Anyway, I came out of graduate school a technical economist who was moderately left of center, I'd say. And I wrote a thesis in which I said, laissez-faire, letting the market do it will not get you racial equality, even if you stop discriminating. It could go on forever. You need the more muscular intervention. So I was for affirmative action. Is equal opportunity enough? That was the title of a paper I gave at the AEA meetings in like 1980. And it was published in the Papers and Proceedings of the American Economic Association. Is equal opportunity enough? And I said, no, it's not. Equal opportunity is not enough. So there was that. Now, I was always a little heterodox in my thinking about the civil rights issues because I took the behavior problems in low-income Black communities seriously. And this has been true in my casual writings about race, going all the way back to the late 1970s,
We'll see you soon.
Shortly after I came out of graduate school. I mean, I'm looking at the family. I'm saying, you know, kids born out of wedlock and stuff like that. I'm looking at the criminal behavior, the violence and stuff like that. And I'm looking at school failure and, you know, what's happening in terms of the acquisition of cognitive skills, which is, you know, demonstrably less effective in certain communities. And I'm saying, is that a civil rights issue? Is that a question of something the system needs to change? Maybe the system could be a part of the solution to that problem, but maybe also some of the impetus for solving that problem has to come from the communities themselves. This kind of idea has been in my thinking for nearly a half century, and it was sitting alongside my commitment to an aggressive program of rectification of the historic injustice of racism and discrimination. So there was always a tension there.
And there's also your own life story, which is kind of interconnected here. You had kids out of you had kids in wedlock.
I was a father at the age of 18. I had 2 daughters, and then their mother, Charlene, my daughters, Lisa and Tamara, who are in their 50s now, came into the world when I was 18 and 19 years old, respectively. And Alden came along a year later to a relationship outside of that marriage that I was involved in when I was 20 years old. You know, so I had 3 kids, and I wasn't yet 21 years old. I was a full-time employee at a printing plant because I had to go to work because I had these kids, and ultimately a wife. And also then eventually a full-time student at Northwestern University. I was working 40 hours a week while I was acing the advanced calculus and the economic theory PhD courses at Northwestern. I'm not making that up.
The book's believable because you made it believable. You put it all out there. So how do you go from becoming, you know, influenced by your MIT background and your thesis work and then you have this experience that, you know, the anxiety episode connected to cocaine, connected to rehab, connected to becoming a Christian and then born again Christian, and then you've got a lot of these transformations, and then rebirth at Boston University, which I'll, you know, put it that way. And then over time, you become more I don't know, at some point you become more conservative and then less conservative, more conservative. Tell us a bit about that.
Okay, so I was, this may annoy you, I was impressed by the supply siders. When the Reagan Revolution came along, late 70s, early 80s, and people, well, I mean, some of them were not crazy supply siders. Some of them were people like Martin Feldstein, who just said the marginal tax rate matters. It affects the allocation of resources, and you might want to try to get that one right. You know, especially if you're talking about the allocation of capital, you might actually care about the inflation adjusted real rate of return on assets, and you might want to think through the implications of et cetera. But so some of it was just I mean, you know, the kind of stuff that I would expect Larry Kotlikoff to go along with. Some of it was less respectable, you know, the Arthur Laffers of the world, and you know, tax cuts are going to pay for themselves and stuff like that. And a lot matters. The details matter a lot, and I'm not that kind of an economist, so I was looking at it from afar. But I started reading these books. The George Gilder, Jude Wanniski. I know I don't mean to upset you. I know they're disreputable in serious academic public finance quarters. I started reading the American Spectator. I started reading the National Review. I started reading the Spectator, coming from the UK. And I got to know the neoconservatives, the Jewish intellectual, New York intellectuals like Irving Kristol, and Norman Podhoretz, and Nathan Glazer, and others, who were James Q. Wilson, not Jewish, he's Catholic, Irish Catholic political scientist who was writing about crime. The people around the Public Interest magazine, which was a flourishing center right, you know, liberals who've been mugged by reality. People who in 1950 were just recently dusting off their Communist Party membership cards or hiding them from the McCarthyites, but who drifted with the urban crisis and looking at the stuff that went on in the 60s and looking at shifts in the culture and the political temper of society, and had this kind of critical stance. And I was attracted by that. So I was in this orbit. Tom Schelling saw my despair in the economics department at Harvard after a couple of years and invited me to come over to the Kennedy School of Government, a different faculty within Harvard. Just moved my professorship from the Faculty of Arts and Sciences to the faculty of the Kennedy School, and be able to explore the wider range of my interests, of my political and policy and my interest in philosophy and in sociology and stuff like that. And I did, and I flourished at the Kennedy School. I moved over there after 2 years at Harvard, and I started meeting policymakers. I started participating in professional education programs at the Kennedy School. I got to know a lot of the faculty at the Kennedy School who were all over in terms of disciplines: historians, political scientists, philosophers, ethicists, defense intellectuals like Tom, and economists like Richard Zeckhauser and others, and a lot of policy-driven applied economic analysis. And it affected me. But you asked me about political transition, and I think it started when I spent a couple of years in Detroit. My late wife, who's been mentioned here, Linda, and I left MIT, me in 76, her in 78. I went to Northwestern, she went to Michigan. But we were a couple, and I decided to move to Michigan and join her in 79. And I spent 3 years there before the Harvard offer came. And I spent a lot of time in Detroit, and it really impacted me. I mean, Detroit was sliding into, it seemed like a deep hole. There was a lot of different kinds of stuff that was going on. There was social economic stuff. There was crime and welfare dependency and poverty and poor housing and the collapsing neighborhoods and disorder. But there was also the economic transformation that was going on with the old industrial heartland kind of prosperity breaking apart. The auto industry pricing, the steel industry, the rubber and glass, all this kind of stuff going on around Detroit, all this union driven economic policy contestation. And I had my doubts about it. I was kind of, as I say, I was with the supply siders. My gut was feather bedding is not going to be a solution to the problem. You know,
Mhm.
you do have to respond to the competition. If the Japanese or the Germans or the Koreans or whatever are producing these appliances or whatever, and they got their costs where they are, you can't, you know, compete with them. You could raise your tariffs, but that's not actually a solution to the problem of getting your cost structure in a rational order, stuff like that. I started opening my mind to these ideas, both on the race questions. It can't all be discrimination. Another march is not going to solve the problem, not really. Racism, yes, it does exist, but actually, it's not the reason that you don't have a job. So it was those kind of thinkings, but also just as an economist, I was starting to think, you know, the price theory guys at Chicago probably got it more right than wrong.
Okay, so that's uh, clear as to why you become more conservative, both economically in terms of economic policy and affirmative action. But what is this transformation into kind of rejecting to some degree uh, these propositions, and then you come back to them? You know, tell us about
You
that.
got to read the book. People have to read the book.
Okay, we can do that. We can say that too.
But yeah, so I have a chapter in which I discuss the impact on me of 3 books. This is the 90s. So to make a long story short, I'm a Reagan conservative in the 80s, and I have a personal scandal in my life that sort of ends my political aspirations and pushes me back into a reflective posture. I recover my footing as a applied theoretical economist in years where I was very productive at Boston University. Thank you very much. And having done that, I begin to think again more broadly about policy, but now from a different posture. I mean, one of the things that's different is I've gone through a religious conversion, which was a part of my restoration, was a part of my recovery from drug addiction and from psychological collapse. I was in deep trouble in 1987, 1988, and I managed, with the loving support of my wife, Linda, to turn it around. And I became a born again Christian, and I was a believer. There was a time in there where I was very fervent and certain about, in my convictions, at least I thought I was, about the divinity of Jesus Christ. I mean, he had died for me personally, Glenn Cartman Lowry, my savior. By virtue of my relationship with Jesus Christ, I was able to connect with the creator of the universe himself. And all of that, you've heard this story before, I assume. I was a believer, and that affected my political posture a little bit. It wasn't enough just to be right about the liberals being wrong. You had to actually want to do something to help the people who were the objects of this kind of disputation about policy, whether it be criminal justice policy or welfare policy or educational policy, income support and child welfare and things of this kind. And I got stimulated to look into the incarceration issue because, as you will be aware, this was a period when the use of imprisonment as an instrument of social control and in a response to law enforcement problems was growing rapidly in the United States. We went from 500,000 under lock and key on a given day in 1980 to 2 million under lock and key on a given day in 2000. That's a quadrupling of the incarcerated population in 2 decades. This was going on in real time as I'm describing this period in my life, and I was impacted by it and the racial disparity in the incarceration and whatnot. So I ended up getting drawn more and more into this posture of critic of the established order with respect to questions of race and racial equality. And to a certain degree, there were other psychological factors that were at play. I had problems with some of my conservative friends who I thought were callous and were not sufficiently subtle in their thinking about the problem, and whom I suspected might even harbor certain, unlovely thoughts about Black people, including your humble servant. Uh, and I also I wanted Jesse Jackson to like me. Jesse Jackson is just one guy, but I wanted to be accepted back into the fold of my co-racialists. I was getting pressure from people in my family, even my own adult children. By this time, my oldest, Lisa, who was born in 1967, is 30 years old. She can speak for herself. And I'm getting pressure. What kind of person are you? You're on the wrong side of all the political issues and whatnot. I was seeking maybe a little bit to be able to go home again, home metaphorically speaking. And when I got invited by the Harvard Afro Studies establishment, Henry Louis Gates Jr., Cornel West, Anthony Appiah, Lawrence Bobo, these people who are all professors now. West and Appiah are no longer at Harvard, but they were professors, part of the establishment. William Julius Wilson, the sociologist. These are all very distinguished scholars of African American history and culture. And they invited me to give these Du Bois lectures, named after the great W.E.B. Du Bois. In 2000, I was invited to give the lectures. And that was like the culmination of this whole rehabilitation program that I had been on for 5 years of, you see, I'm not as bad as you thought I was. I know I was a conservative Reaganite in the 80s, but I really have, I'm, trying to redeem myself. And I know I was this guy that you thought was this vagabond, this scumbag guy that was out there doing all kinds of crazy stuff. Well, we all slip. None of us is perfect, but I'm back and I'm, steady and I'm worthy and like me, please like me. Some of that was going on. And there was also pushing from some of the conservatives. So I have a chapter in the book where I talk about the three books that came out in 1994, 1995, and 1997. It was The Bell Curve by Charles Murray, 1994. It was The End of Racism by Dinesh D'Souza, that's 95 or 96. And then it was America in Black and White by Abigail and Stephen Thernstrom, that's 1997. Now, these were all friends of mine. These were people I knew because the American Enterprise Institute sponsored Murray and D'Souza, and I was an advisor to Christopher Demuth, who was president of the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., a conservative think tank. I was in the club. I got invited to the dinners at the Cosmos Club, Larry, down in D.C. to sit around with the bigwig fat cats and conservative intellectual circles, the William F. Buckleys of the world, and so on. So I knew these people, and the Thernstoms were very good friends of mine. They lived in Lexington. I lived in Brookline, Massachusetts. We were all kind of centered around Harvard. Stephen Thernstrom, a professor in the history department there. I'm a professor in the Kennedy School until I left and came over to Boston University, but I'm still a part of that general environment. And their book I reviewed their book for the Atlantic Monthly magazine in 1997 at length, and I didn't like it. I didn't like their book. I hated D'Souza's book, which I thought he has since lived up to the enmity that I developed for him when I read that book. I mean, I don't like what D'Souza does at all. Anybody can look him up and decide for themselves what they think about that. But The Bell Curve, I mean, that was a shattering experience for me, really. This is the book about intelligence in American life, and the book that argues, amongst many other things, that there are serious racial differences in intelligence that have consequences for social equality, for what can be expected to be achieved, and that are, at least to some degree, under genetic influence and not amenable to policy manipulation. This is Murray and Herrnstein. I had a deep problem with that book. So I started I had a platform at the New Republic, Martin Peretz, Leon Wieseltier, those guys, the people like Peter Beinart who were running the New Republic magazine, which is, if I may say so, a much more serious and influential intellectual organ then than it is now. That was when the New Republic was really the New Republic. If you ask me, there are people who will disagree. We can talk. But I had a column, hard questions, they called it. They rotated amongst me and 3 or 4 other people like Michael Walzer, Michael Sandel. These are the kinds of people who were writing critical ethics columns for the New Republic. And I was in their number, and I would use it to give voice to my dissatisfaction with these books that I didn't like, and with this smug tenor of what I took to be of the conservative critics on the race front, where all they had was negativity. All they had to do was say that the liberals have gotten it wrong, and they were, it seemed to me, way too willing to accept as what can I do? As Bill Buckley once said this to me, William F. Buckley, in a private meeting, but it's been 25 years more. He said, if I'm a physician and I have a patient who is fatally ill, and I decide to move on to the next case, that doesn't mean I don't care. It just means there's nothing to be done. It's time to move on to the next case. And that was being said in reference to the case at hand was the poor social economic condition of the African-American part of the African-American populace, what was languishing in the ghettos of the city, in the jails, in the public hospital waiting rooms, and the welfare lines. And, the kids were hungry, living off of food stamps and whatnot. And I just couldn't take that. I felt like if I was silent and acquiesced in the face of that, I really would be the self-hating Black man that my Black liberal critics accused me of for being a conservative. It just wasn't good enough. It wasn't deep enough, I thought. And that led me to move away from the conservatives in the 90s, and really to make a career out of moving away from the conservatives. There were 15 years between the mid 90s and I'd say 2010 when my public intellectual persona was animated by the criticism that I had to offer, or the rage that I harbored, or the contempt that I felt for the right-wing conservative critics on the race and social policy questions.
But then there's a transformation yet again, more to the right. So is this, it could be that there's the same Glenn Lowry and the same basic views, just that these views are, coming out in reaction to certain things, but that the core view is actually staying the same throughout the whole period. I'm trying to help you discover what your book's about, the original question. I'm not sure that, I think that's the fascinating thing about the book, actually, that people get to draw their connections and just look at you now. Anybody who's a drug addict and is having, or anxiety problems, or having self-doubts, they could be, just looking at you, listening to you, and understand that there's hope, that there's a path ahead, that, that this is not a long sentence. You're a heroic figure in many ways, Glenn. Yes, you've got your beliefs, and maybe they've changed, or maybe they were constant, but you're reacting to certain other segments of, other people to maintain your core beliefs, or maybe your core beliefs were changing, or whatever. But there's a very interesting story here, and it's ultimately one of success, failure, success. It's the American, it's, you know, you're a hero of mine. I really
Oh.
am thrilled to know you. And I think everybody else will get to know you through this book if they don't know you already. So unfortunately, we're kind of into
Yeah,
this pretty.
that's a note that we can end on, Larry. I'm happy to end on that note, me being a hero of yours, which I am very grateful and gratified to hear you say. I'm doing my best. And I sure do hope that there's somebody out there struggling with the problems of emergency concerns in their life, like addiction and marital infidelity and professional anxiety and religious doubt, who can get something of benefit in their lives out of my story. That would make me very, very happy to know. So thanks, Larry. Thanks for talking about my book at your show.
Thanks so much, John, man.